This is Dr. Karen, and you are listening to the Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network, where I share up-to-date, evidence-based practices, my own experiences, and guest interviews designed to help pediatric therapists, educators, and aspiring school leaders design services that support social, emotional, and academic growth and set kids up for success in adulthood. Whether you want to learn effective strategies for your therapy session or classroom, be an influential leader on your team, or find creative ways to use your skills to advance in your career, I've got you covered. Hey everybody, it's Dr. Karen, and welcome to episode 167 of the De Facto Leaders podcast on the B Podcast Network. Today I'm sharing content from a blog post I wrote back in April about 3 shifts that school teams can make when thinking about programming that supports students' executive functioning. So check the show notes for links to the blog post if you want to see this in written form, as well as links to the School of Clinical Leadership, which is mentioned throughout this post. The School of Clinical Leadership is a program for psychologists, social workers, speech pathologists, counselors, occupational therapists, or other school service providers who want an evidence-based plan for supporting students socially, emotionally, and academically by putting executive functioning programming in place. To learn more about the program, you can go to drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership. As a professional field, we're getting stuck in old ways of thinking when it comes to designing services for students experiencing executive dysfunction. When we think of therapy, the first thing that comes to mind is a clinician in a chair saying things like, "And how does that make you feel?" Or maybe a clinician doing exercises with a student or groups of students in either a one-on-one or a group setting. When we think of planning for therapy, we think of what materials or activities we're going to do in our direct therapy sessions. And with social skills intervention, we often think of an adult teaching a group of kids how to follow the rules in social situations, while students answer questions and discuss to demonstrate their understanding. Lack of generalization continues to be one of the biggest pain points for therapists using these models. And while most clinicians agree that collaboration with other professionals and caregivers is important, the planning for those activities is often less intentional than the way we plan for direct intervention. That's why in the School of Clinical Leadership, the first thing I teach clinicians is how to create a long-term strategic plan for putting executive functioning support in place for their caseloads, and sometimes the entire school using multiple service delivery models. When the entire intervention starts and ends with a traditional therapy session, students don't generalize executive functioning skills across settings. We as a field need to evolve in the way we think about what's included in therapy services for executive functioning. So there are 3 paradigm shifts clinicians, educators, and school leaders can make when thinking about supporting kids' executive functioning in schools. Shift 1 is understanding the difference between planning for service delivery and planning for therapy. Shift 2 is understanding the difference between siloed social skills groups and front-loading and reviewing. And Shift 3 is understanding the difference between scalable protocols and lesson plans. Now I'll go into each one at a time. First, we'll talk about planning for service delivery versus planning for therapy. One of the biggest challenges therapists have when it comes to executive functioning is generalization. Clinicians often express that they see poor generalization with both pragmatic language or social skills. The first distinction that clinicians can make is thinking of pragmatic language under the umbrella of executive functioning. Successful application of pragmatic language requires someone to read a room and infer the thoughts, feelings, and perspectives of others in varying situations, And this extends beyond casual socializing because we can apply this to academic or vocational situations where you need to work with others. When we think of pragmatic language as part of executive functioning, it becomes even more obvious why these skills can't be addressed with a pull-out therapy model alone. It's therefore important for clinicians to shift from therapy planning to service delivery planning. I like to use buckets as an analogy for explaining the difference between service delivery planning and traditional lesson or session planning. When we think about therapy services, the model is like a bucket we can fill with things. This could be materials, strategies, protocols, things like that. We'd give that bucket a label with the right amount of flexibility and specificity that it could help us organize what we need to do to deliver services. Planning for direct intervention is one of those buckets because it's one service delivery model. But repeatedly, I see clinicians putting lots of things inside their pull-out therapy or direct intervention bucket. And this includes things that can be delivered in a group therapy setting, in a lesson, or in a one-on-one format. Now, of course, we need to have quality things in the direct intervention bucket. There are some skills that specifically need to be in this bucket in order for kids to get the intensity that they need with certain tasks and skills. And I actually have a blog post where I explain why this is the case, which I can link to. The name of the blog post is Push In, Pull Out, Co-Teaching, What's the Most Functional for Language Therapy? Because as I explain in the article, sometimes you actually do want to use a pull-out model. So, as I said before, we need a lot of good things in this bucket, but that's not the only bucket we need to fill. We also need to fill the consultation and coaching bucket, the training and development bucket, the protocols and materials bucket, and the long-term strategic planning bucket. There are more that we could include, but these are the big ones. So this means instead of just filling the direct intervention bucket with more therapy materials, we can create protocols for having a consultation or coaching session with the teacher. We could be documenting our therapy techniques by creating shareable resources to give other professionals or parents so they can implement strategies outside our sessions. We could work with our leadership or adjacent team members on a long-term plan for how we're going to block out time for all of these things to happen over the course of the next year. So even if our direct therapy time looks like the biggest bucket based on the time blocks in our daily schedules, we can and should fill the other buckets. When we plan intentionally for how we're going to deliver these other models for students, this is what I mean by planning for service delivery. It's macro level, strategic, and focused on what's happening across a student's day using different models of delivering services, instead of just focusing on that one time block on your schedule when you have your students in front of you. The next shift is understanding the difference between front-loading and reviewing versus siloed social skills groups. One of the largest pendulum swings I've seen relating to K-12 education is the discussion about social skills groups. So there are a lot of questions like, are they ableist? Are they educationally relevant? And most importantly, do they work? So my answer to those questions is no, they're not ableist. Yes, they're educationally relevant. And as to whether or not they work, I'd say it depends. So it goes without saying that we have to equip students with the skills they need to interact with others. This is not a neurotypical skill, it's a human skill. So regardless of whether you're interacting with a neurotypical or neurodivergent person, there needs to be a give and take in the relationship, and all parties need to consider how their behavior impacts others or how they're coming across. This is very important for self-advocacy, independent functioning, as well as maintaining healthy relationships. And when done correctly, social skills intervention, or more accurately, intervention focused on executive functioning for social situations, can give kids the skills they need to navigate the nuances of human relationships. Assuming they won't be able to learn these skills is not only ableist, but it also puts them in a very vulnerable situation. And I actually have a post where I explain why that's the case and why social skills intervention isn't just teaching kids to act neurotypical. So the post that I can link to is called How to Make Better Accommodations by Being Less Accommodating. So it explains why we all need to understand how to have relationships, regardless of whether we're neurotypical or neurodivergent. Again, I will link to that post in the show notes. So no, social skills interventions aren't ableist when they're done the right way. But as to whether they're educationally relevant, well, kids need to interact with peers and adults throughout their school day. So these skills are certainly relevant to helping them succeed in school. But the last question is a common point of confusion. Do social skills groups work? The way people often do them, they typically don't. However, that can change if we rethink the purpose of the social skills group and where it fits within your service delivery plan. Many social skills groups are delivered as if they're the complete package. In other words, the student or students come in for therapy, do some role play or a lesson plan discussing feelings or social rules, and the intervention protocol ends there. There might be an attempt at collaboration between professionals, but those collaborative efforts are thought of as the icing on the cake, not the cake itself. When social skills groups are done that way, there's poor generalization, regardless of the credentials and skills of the person leading the intervention. Sometimes kids may try to apply what they've learned to peer interactions, but it ends up feeling forced and awkward for them because they've learned a list of contrived rules instead of truly learning to read the room and respond during social interactions. Many people then draw the conclusion that we should ditch the idea of social skills or social emotional learning completely, which is problematic. It's equally problematic to make the assumption that all social skills interventions are ableist. If you're focusing on things like situational awareness and perspective taking, you're teaching kids skills that are important for both neurotypical and neurodivergent people. So, what is the right way to do social skills groups? My first suggestion is to stop calling them social skills groups. This could help reframe things for people and disrupt their default assumption of what happens in a social skills group. Instead, we might just think of them as meetings with students to prepare them for stuff coming up in their lives. In other words, there's an appropriate way for professionals to meet one-on-one or in groups of students to discuss upcoming events or situations, but the meetings with students is part of a bigger intervention plan, not the entire intervention. It might still be listed as therapy minutes on their IEP, but we can think differently of how we utilize that time and can potentially add some consultation minutes or accommodations to document other service models. This goes back to the idea of service delivery planning versus therapy planning because it requires multiple service delivery models. So really we need to shift where social skills groups fit. When we think about executive functioning support in the context of a larger service plan, there are three main components. And we can apply this specifically to social skills, but it really applies to anything that involves executive functioning. So we want to think about three intervention components, or really three intervention contexts. We have priming, real-life practice, and review and evaluation. So I'll go through each one of those one at a time to explain what it could include, and I'll give some examples about how it could apply to social skills specifically. So priming includes planning and preparing for upcoming situations to give kids cues and strategies. This can include role playing, practicing skills in a structured environment where it's safe and you can practice things that maybe you're nervous about doing in the future. It could also include front-loading information or strategizing to help kids envision and plan ahead for future events. So here is where it's appropriate in the service plan to do meetings with students. So here's where we can shift how we're thinking about those social skills groups and instead think of them as opportunities to prime and front load information based on things that are coming up. And so this can be one-time events. So maybe the child has a test that they're going to do, or maybe they have a presentation that they're doing in class. Maybe they're going to be in the school play or something like that, where you've got to practice something. Maybe there's some kind of unstructured group assignment that's coming up. So there's a lot of ways that you can use this priming context. One common example that I give that is more academic would be priming to give kids strategies for writing assignments. So you can use your priming as an opportunity to practice some of those skills and give kids tools that they can use to outline or do some of the steps required in preparing to do a more difficult writing assignment. But of course, it doesn't stop here. That's not the entire intervention. All you're doing is preparing for something that lies ahead. So again, it could be one-time events or it can be things that are ongoing. We also might use this as an opportunity to just share information. One common front-loading task that was done with some of the students that I worked with was that when kids are in 6th grade and they're getting ready to go to the junior high next year, they have an opportunity to go over and do a tour of the junior high. And for some kids, we might actually do a couple extra sessions for them. So I know that some of the kids in the special education classroom would do an extra smaller group tour, and then maybe they had the opportunity to do a tour before school started, in addition to what all of the other kids got. So here are just some examples of front loading. And really what you're doing here is teaching strategies with the mindset that you're giving some tools, and then eventually you're going to be giving students the opportunity to go practice them in something that's happening in their real life. So this is why I say we should think about social skills groups as meetings with students to prepare them for things that are coming up in their lives. So priming is just one intervention context. Then we also have real life practice. And real life practice is where the majority of the learning happens. Adults supporting kids in their daily lives should be prepared to model and scaffold so kids can apply strategies they've been practicing in therapy. In order to make this happen, you'll need to utilize other models like consultation, coaching, supporting materials, and having a bigger strategic plan, because you need to make sure that you've trained people so that after you do your priming, someone is going to support kids once they go out to do real life practice. That might be you. Maybe you've created a plan with a teacher to go into their classroom or go support students during some time during their school day. Or maybe you've worked with someone else and trained them so someone else is going to do it. The main thing here is that this is not an intervention context that can be done in a typical social skills group format. It needs to happen in a naturally occurring context. Yes, in your priming, you can get it as close to real life as possible, but it's still not the same thing, even if you do a role play. And it's fine to do a role play, but you want to think about it as a dress rehearsal for the main event. Kids actually need to experience the main event if they're really going to build these skills. And when I say naturally occurring context, this can include a combination of structured academic and unstructured social situations. And I know that your setting might determine the type of social situations that you're preparing kids for. So obviously, if you are working in a school, you are focused on things that are academically relevant, but there are many times during the day that are less structured during the school day. And so you can certainly make a case for this being educationally relevant if kids are struggling to work with kids in groups or during those unstructured times like the lunchroom, like passing periods, recess, and those types of things. Again, this is why we want to think about multiple service delivery models and think about the big picture, because when we are planning for service delivery, we're not just thinking about what are my activities that I'm going to do when I'm priming, for example. We're thinking about how am I going to make all of these things happen, and what activities do I need to plan in order to make sure that they happen during the student's day. So that means you'd be planning for your priming sessions, and you'd be putting things in your materials and lesson planning bucket. But you also might be putting some things in your consultation and coaching bucket, because you might be planning some agendas for meetings that you have with teachers or other people who are supporting your students. and you're planning to figure out how they're going to support kids once they leave your therapy room. And the other thing that people don't think about as much is the supporting materials bucket, because a lot of times people say to me, I don't have time to do all this consultation and training. No, of course not. You don't have time to be doing that all day, but you can provide supporting materials so that you can get more out of that consultation and coaching time by giving something that people can have to support what you're sharing with them. And that might be able to help you cut down on the time that you need to actually meet face-to-face. Face-to-face time is going to be important, but you might be able to streamline it by creating supporting materials, videos, things like that, that you can share with parents, teachers, other related service providers who are supporting students. And of course, all of these things fit within your bigger strategic plan. So if you are someone who has maybe you've got some good strategies that you've been doing with your students in the groups where they're meeting with you one-on-one or in a pull-out setting, and you want to start thinking about those other service delivery models. What's going to be really important in you making that happen is creating that strategic plan, because you've got to create a strategic plan for yourself to figure out how you're going to add all of those different habits to your workflow. So let's go back to those 3 intervention contexts. Again, we have priming, real life practice. So we've primed students, we've front loaded, we've prepared them with strategies, we've allowed them to go out into real life and practice whatever it is we're doing. And then we have a review and evaluation context. So again, this is kind of a cyclical, iterative process. Review and evaluation is a part of intervention where adults can help kids reflect on past situations, evaluate their ability to apply strategies, and help make decisions about how to use that new knowledge for future events. Within that same conversation that you might be having with your students when you're doing review and evaluation, you may also cycle back to doing some priming for the future as you fine-tune skills and fade prompts. So for example, let's say that you have primed a student for a writing assignment. You've taught them some strategies, you've rehearsed them, you've given them the tools, you've trained the teacher to be able to support your student, and then they go into their classroom, they do the writing assignment, and then you're going to review how it went with them, reflect on it, go through the strategy and figure out what went well and what the student learned. And then maybe you start to talk about, okay, based on what we know and what we've learned, what do we want to change and what do we need to practice for the future? Now, I know that I just gave an academic example, so let me give you a social example. I had one student who was really interested in bugs, and he wanted to talk about them all the time. He wanted to hang out with somebody at recess and just look for bugs, but he didn't know how to approach another kid and ask if they wanted to hang out or have a back and forth conversation with them. He would just go up to them and just start talking about bugs. And a lot of times the other kids would get kind of confused because he didn't start the conversation in a way that they expected. So that was something we had to walk through. We had to talk about how you might start a conversation with someone. We had to talk about having a back and forth conversation and giving both people the opportunity to talk about things that they're interested in and things like that. So that helped him to figure out how he wanted to spend his recess time and help him decide if he wanted to spend some time hanging out by himself or if he wanted to try to find somebody else to hang out with him, or just how he wanted to navigate that situation. Now, with the social situations, you have to get a little more creative with how you provide that support because you don't want to be intrusive. So luckily, the teaching assistants I was working with knew how to be kind of stealth and maybe have a side conversation with him before he was going out to recess and then kind of catch him on the way in. So it wasn't something where they were hovering while he was trying to hang out with his friends. So you do have to get creative about how you do that support in social situations. So a lot of times it's just a quick reminder before they go out to whatever it is that they're doing and just reminding them of what their strategies are instead of actually being there and scaffolding within the situations. So how that looks varies based on the activity. So that's why it's important for this to be a simple strategy, but also something you do collaboratively so you can figure out how you're going to do those things. So again, we had to do some priming. I had to talk to the teaching assistant that was with the students at recess to do some training and give her some strategies. Then I had to let my student go out and experience recess. And then we reviewed and evaluated, and that helped me to figure out what additional communication I needed to have with the people supporting him, and also helped us to figure out what else we could be doing in our meetings. The review and evaluation phase is another place where it would be appropriate to do meetings with students. So this is a cyclical process, but when we think of it this way, we are not necessarily thinking about social skills as something that we can address with some kind of a curriculum or a lesson plan. Yes, there might be things that are marketed as a curriculum that you could find helpful that you might pull in, but the main thing that you want guiding your lesson plans, and I use that with big air quotes, is the things that are happening in students' lives, not some pre-made curriculum. If you find materials that are relevant that you can pull in to help supplement what you're doing, that's great. There's nothing wrong with that, but you don't want it to be what guides your intervention. The things that are happening in students' lives should be what is determining what you are addressing in therapy. I know that many times people are doing group sessions, and that can be tricky as far as planning. And maybe in that case, you might cycle through some of the different things that people are experiencing in your session if you've got multiple kids. But the main thing is you want it to be focused on them and not something that is a pre-made list of rules or worksheet or something like that. Unless, of course, you've determined already that those materials or lesson plans are relevant to things going on in your students' lives. And of course, you're doing it within the context of a bigger service plan that includes all of these intervention contexts. We want to start with the service plan and then insert the student groups where they fit, instead of thinking of the entire intervention as starting and ending with the group. You actually don't even need a social skills group to make this happen. That is just one delivery mechanism where you could do this for your students. You could even just have someone who has side conversations with them throughout the day. Parents can do this for their kids when they're driving in the car. The teacher can do it in some kind of a check-in with the students. So you don't technically have to have a social skills group in order to do all of these things. So we want to be flexible in how we think about this. But yes, if you have room in your schedule for a time that you could meet with students, this is one way that you could utilize that time and make it more aligned with something that is going to be useful to them. So to review what we've talked about so far, the first shift was about shifting from the idea of therapy planning versus service delivery planning. And this does not mean we need to throw out the idea of lesson planning or session planning, whatever you want to call it for yourself, but we want to also transition to including service delivery planning as well. And then shift 2 is understanding the difference between siloed social skills groups, where the intervention starts and ends with the session, versus thinking of social skills groups as a tool for front-loading or evaluating and reviewing. And again, like I said, you technically don't need to do it in a social skills group. There are other ways you can front-load and review. But like I said, a social skills group is one way that you could make that happen. So the final shift is scalable protocols versus lesson plans. So with this one, we don't need to completely ditch the idea of lesson plans, but we want to learn how to add scalable protocols to our skill set and our practice. Once clinicians buy into the idea of using multiple service delivery models like I've been describing, as well as the idea of coaching others, they run into logistics issues. They often say things like, "That sounds great, but how am I going to have time to meet with teachers?" Other people get stuck because even if they do find the time to meet with teachers, they don't know what to do with that time. And this is because knowing how to deliver therapy yourself is a different skill set than knowing how to document your clinical protocols for purposes of training others. Thinking of your session planning in terms of scalability is the first step in being able to train, coach, and supervise others. Scalability refers to the potential for growth and expansion. The easier a strategy is to define and document, the easier it is to scale. You can then scale it by training different people in the process so that it's happening more frequently. And this is why I make my protocols and materials as simple as possible in the School of Clinical Leadership. Identifying your scalable protocols can give clarity on how to utilize professional collaboration time, because you've defined what information you need to share and where you might need to get feedback. It's often easier to scale operational things like how to fill out payroll forms, but with teaching and therapy, where there's a need for differentiated instruction and a lot of on-the-spot problem solving, it gets much more difficult. This is why school leaders focus so much time and effort on things like core curriculum, because they face the challenge of implementing a curriculum that's scalable across classrooms within grade levels, as well as when students move from one grade level to another. The complexity of this task makes it difficult for school administrators to find the bandwidth to focus on adding additional layers to this process, such as universal support for executive functioning, for example. Now, when therapists focus on scalability, it looks a little different. And that's why this is where school therapists can become a huge asset to their leadership by adding an additional layer of support on top of school administrators' efforts with things such as the curriculum. So what this means for you is that while you're planning for therapy, what you can do is develop strategies that will be easy to document, share, and coach others to do. Scaling for you could happen when you train other professionals in your building to do strategies in their classrooms. It could also include creating tools and resources that can be shared with caregivers. And there's tons of other examples, but those are just a couple that I can think of off the top of my head. Now, a caveat here is that not every protocol can and should be scalable to the point that people outside your discipline can do it. There are certainly some things that have to be delivered in a therapy session with a licensed clinician, and of course, sometimes a licensed clinician within a specific discipline. This may mean you have a set of protocols that you intend to do yourself in your sessions, but then you'd have other protocols that you'd intend to scale to other people. So again, we don't want to completely ditch the idea of the traditional session plan or lesson plan, or however it is you like to plan your day-to-day. What we're doing is we're adding another layer. With executive functioning intervention, we need to be even more intentional about making things scalable, or else we're not likely to see good generalization. So you can see how these three shifts that I've talked about today really play off of each other, because we have the big picture thinking about service delivery. And then I gave you a specific example of one specific area where it's essential to think about different intervention contexts. But to make those intervention contexts happen successfully, we need to utilize those other service delivery models. But in order to be able to utilize those other service delivery models, such as coaching and consultation, we need to make the things that we're doing when students are with us, for example, while we're priming and teaching strategies, we need to make those things scalable. Now, there might be certain interventions that you are the only person who is qualified to do them. And having clarity on what you can scale to other people versus what you need to be doing in your sessions can really free up a lot of bandwidth and help you to be more strategic in how you do use that therapy time when you have students with you. So that's why in the School of Clinical Leadership, all of the strategies that I teach are easy to scale because they're incredibly simple and don't require any special materials beyond normal day-to-day items. So it could be things like analog clocks, dry erase boards, calendars, images, things that you can pull together, or really things that you can help other people pull together as well. Because if you want it to scale, you need to make it feasible for as many people as possible. This is why for executive functioning, and for the example that I gave today, social skills groups, you want to err on the side of doing things that you can pull in based on what's going on with the kids that you're seeing. Because if you focus on lesson plans, then it tends to overcomplicate things. And that makes it more difficult to coach and train other people in what you're doing. The more steps in a process that you're teaching, the more likely it is that people are going to get confused and not do it. So we want to keep it as simple as possible and get really good at a couple core staple strategies so that you can start training other people how to do them. So to wrap up, that is exactly why I provide a set of scalable protocols in the School of Clinical Leadership, but I also give you the tools you need to create a strategic plan for putting those other service delivery models in place. That's really what the program is about. The School of Clinical Leadership is a program for psychologists, school social workers, speech pathologists, counselors, occupational therapists, or other service providers who want to put executive functioning support in place. And as I described today, it's really way beyond just thinking about materials and lesson plans. And the way that you make the bandwidth to focus on those other things is to keep your lesson plans as simple as possible so that you have time to think about those other things. Sometimes less is more, and this is one of those times. It really only takes one team member to take the lead and get the team on track, because if you are thinking about things in terms of scalability, that's what's going to help you to train others so that eventually you can team up with other people. Maybe if you are the speech pathologist, for example, you can team up with the social worker, and then both of you can start training people. But if it's not being done in your building, you can be the one to start that initiative. With the right system, it's possible even if you have limited time and resources, and even if you're not in an official leadership position. As I said before, a lot of times the leadership has so many different things on their plate, so they appreciate it when people can add additional value by adding these additional layers on top of the initiatives that they're already doing. One of the other concepts that I talk about in the program is asset stacking, where you are creating assets that you can use in order to make the most of your time. So assets could be things like relationships that you build with other people on your team. They can be your protocols that you come up with that you can scale to other people. They could be the materials that you create that go with those protocols. And what you're going to find over time as you do that, as you stack one asset on top of another, is that you start to get better results and you start to create more time blocks in your day that you can think bigger picture. So to sum up those shifts again, we have planning for service delivery versus planning for therapy, siloed social skills groups versus front loading and reviewing, and lesson plans versus scalable protocols. So I wanted to mention a couple things that I'm going to link to in the show notes that I mentioned in this episode today. The first one is my article called Push In, Pull Out, Co-Teaching, What is Most Functional for Language Therapy. So in that article, I talk about how to distinguish between skills that need to be addressed in a pull-out setting, because sometimes it is beneficial and necessary to do that. So we want to make sure that we understand how to problem solve in those situations. Then I have another article that is called How to Make Better Accommodations by Being Less Accommodating, where I talk about how important it is to teach kids to understand the perspectives of others, because it's not possible to accommodate everything for everyone all the time. If we end up trying to accommodate one person all the time, we end up neglecting other people's needs. So we really need to teach kids the skills of perspective taking and being able to read situations and self-advocate as well. And then I also will link to episode 83 of Facto Leaders, how to provide high quality support for your caseload with the asset stack method. So I talk about the concept of asset stacking that I was discussing at the very end of this episode. And I actually believe that episode was published under the old name for the podcast, Are They 18 Yet? But it should still be in the same podcast feed. Again, that's episode 83. Finally, I will link to the School of Clinical Leadership, my program that helps related service providers put executive functioning support in place in their buildings. That link is drkarendudek-brannan.com/clinical leadership, and I will also include it in the show notes. So thank you so much for listening. If you have a suggestion for a guest, or if you would like to be a guest on the show, or if you'd like to invite me to be a guest on your show, you can email me at talktome@drkarenspeech.com. As always, it helps me so much if you leave me a rating and review on Apple or Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you next time.